So as many of you know, this program was originally scheduled for 2020, but due to the pandemic, we did have to postpone, and we are so happy to be able to be putting that on today. It's my pleasure to get to introduce our speaker, Dr. Sylvia Hoffert. She is a distinguished professor emeritus of history and women's studies from the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill and Texas A&M University. In addition to her teaching career, she is the author of numerous books, including a biography of Alva Vanderbilt Belmont, who was considered quite an unlikely champion of women's rights. Dr. Hoffert is also a member of the Historic Hillsborough Commission, which owns and operates the Burwell School Historic Site, and we are so pleased to have her assistance regularly for that. So we're thankful for her willingness to share today, and after the talk, she's happy to take your questions. So at any point, enter your questions into the chat and I will relay them to her. And now I will turn the mic over to Dr. Hoffert. Thank you.
Thank you, Carrie, and welcome everybody. Thanks for spending your afternoon with us. I'm going to talk today about the British suffrage movement. And in order to do that, I think it's necessary to remind you of some things about British society and politics that make the British suffrage movement different from the American suffrage movement. I'm sure you've seen numerous programs all planned for this disastrous year for giving programs about the American suffrage movement. But so I'm going to just sort of give you some background, give you some context for understanding this. Okay, so the first thing you need to understand is the British suffragists were working in an environment where there's a centralized government. For example, the American suffragists could try to get states to pass suffrage amendments, or they could get the federal government to pass suffrage amendments. The British didn't have that choice. They have a centralized government. Everything comes through Parliament. That's in London. So the center of their efforts are going to be London, and it won't be dispersed at all throughout Britain. That is not to say that there weren't suffrage organizations dispersed around Britain, but the demonstrations and the work is all going to be taking place in London. Secondly, you need to think about class divisions. And I'm talking about class because it has to do with who has the vote. First of all, of course, you have the aristocrats at the top. They have titles. They are known as peers, and they have lots of land. And they make their money by renting out the land to tenants. So that's how they become so rich. Okay, so they're renting out their land. Underneath them are the gentry. They are landowners without titles, and they can vote because they have land. Underneath that is the middle class, and there are various parts of the middle class. The upper part of the middle class was cash rich and land poor, which is to say they had lots and lots of money, but they didn't have land in the countryside. Now they were aspirational, which means that they wanted country estates, and many of them got country estates with their money. But in terms of class, they are always known as, they're middle class. They really aren't gentry or aristocrats. Underneath them are the professionals, the doctors, the lawyers, and the barristers, for example. Underneath those are the shopkeepers. And the worst thing you could say about somebody was that they were in trade. All right, so that was a real put down. So Margaret Thatcher's problem was that she came from a family that was in trade, and she had to overcome that. Underneath those people are the yeoman farmers. So these are small landowners or tenant farmers. And underneath that is the working class. And this working class becomes much more dominant in British society because of industrialization that happened in the 19th century. So this period we're going to be talking about where women's suffrage gets started is a period in which the working class are downtrodden. They object, the labor movement rises, and the labor movement is often violent. All right, so this is going to be the big difference between American suffrage and the British suffrage is the violence that's involved. Okay, history of voting was confined to land ownership. So the gentry could vote, the aristocrats could vote, middle class could not. And as they accumulated more and more money, they began to put pressure on the people who voted, people above them, to include them, all right? And so what you've got in the 19th century are 3 reform bills. This is voting reform. There's one in 1832, one in 1867, and one in 1884. And bit by bit, what the aristocrats and the gentry are doing, who are serving in Parliament, is opening up the vote till by 1884, most men in Britain could vote. Now that's significant because when women's suffrage really starts to get going is when it is clear that it's because of gender that women are excluded. That's the same in the United States. When it became clear in the 1830s under Jackson that most men could vote, and the only reason women couldn't is because they were women, that's when you start getting people really upset. All right. So by 1884, most men in Britain could vote and women could not. The other thing you need to know is that there are two political parties that are important. One are the conservatives and the other is the liberals. The conservatives are conservative. They don't want women to vote. There is nothing in their background that would induce them to think this is a good idea. Liberals, on the other hand, were liberal. One would think they would support women's right to vote. Their problem was that since voting was dependent on property, they were afraid that if they gave women the right to vote, these would be property women and they would vote conservative. So women's suffrage was caught in a double bind. You know, the people who, they knew the conservatives wouldn't support them, but they expected the liberals to. So the liberals wouldn't because they thought that property women would vote conservative. And the two prime ministers that you just need to be sort of subliminally aware of are William Gladstone. He was prime minister from 1868 to 1894. He's a liberal. And then H.H. Asquith, who was prime minister from 1908 to 1916. He was also a liberal. So I will mention Asquith as we go along. All right. All right. 19th century, industrialization, rise of the labor movement, interest in reform because of the reform bills. There's only one name that really sticks out in the 19th century who supported women's rights, and that is John Stuart Mill. He was married to a feminist who wrote The Subjugation of Women in 1869. There was an organization in Kensington, which is a part of London, called the Kensington Society. These are a bunch of intellectuals, including women, and they supported women's suffrage. And so what they did is to draw up a petition, and they sent it to John Stuart Mill, who was an MP, member of Parliament. And he was supposed to present it. The two names that might be familiar to you who signed that was Florence Nightingale. And then another woman who might be less familiar is Josephine Butler. She led the campaign in the 19th century against prostitution. So those are the two big names, but 1,500 other people signed that petition. It, as one might expect, went nowhere, but it was the first effort sort of to organize the demand for women's suffrage. There was also a 19th century suffrage organization called the National Society for Women's Suffrage, founded in 1867 by ladies who did nothing but talk. So nothing really happened in terms of organizations until the early 20th century. And in the early 20th century, the women's rights movement, the women's suffrage movement began out of the labor movement. And the people who were involved were the Pankhursts. Now, Richard Pankhurst was a lawyer. He married Emmeline. He was interested in improving the condition of labor. And so they were very involved in the labor movement, which, as I mentioned before, becomes violent in the 19th century. And their basic tactics were to create havoc. All right. So I want to give you an example of how that would take place. These people are from Manchester. They're not from London. They're from Manchester. They're leading the labor movement. And in the summer of 1896, the labor movement decides they are going to have big rallies. You're kind of familiar with what happens at big rallies. So these are labor demonstrations and speeches, and they were held. Manchester has a park where there is a natural amphitheater. It's a perfect place to give speeches, to hold large group meetings. And so Pankhurst is involved with these labor demonstrations. And the city, of course, is very concerned about what would happen if you bring together thousands of unhappy people in the same place with rabble-rousing speeches. And so they made it clear from the very beginning that they would arrest speakers for what they called occasioning an annoyance. So you could be arrested for occasioning an annoyance. This, of course, was exactly what the rebel rousers wanted to hear. So their size of their meetings grew exponentially. The first one was 1,200. They arrested people. The next one was 4,000. They arrested people. The next was 12,000. They arrested people. And the crowds grew from 25,000 to 40,000. Now you can imagine how disconcerting that was. So speakers were arrested. They were put into prison. And when they were released, this was a celebration, and they got their names in the newspaper. And so the key to the importance of these labor demonstration in Manchester was it gave the Pankhurst women the clue as to how to get attention in an age that wasn't predisposed to think women's right to vote was very important. All right. So Richard dies in 1898. His family, his wife and his 3 children, back off from the labor movement, since the labor movement was a male movement and women weren't necessarily, welcomed. Her entree had been through her husband, Richard. And in 1903, the women moved to London, and they formed what was called the Women's Social and Political Union, the WSPU. Originally, it had a labor focus because they were interested in improving the condition of female laborers, but they also supported female suffrage. And they found that it was not hard to get a suffrage bill introduced to Parliament, but it was never passed. So in 1905, for example, it got introduced. The Women's Franchise Bill got introduced into Parliament, and it was what they called talked out, meaning it was debated until there was no more time. And when there was no more time, they couldn't vote on it. So they considered this outrageous. They were really, really upset about this. So they developed a strategy to gain the attention through violence and outrageous acts to embarrass the liberals, who they expected to be on their side, to raise money, and to increase membership in their organization. The main leaders were Emmeline, Richard's wife, Christabel, who was a trained lawyer. She was the strategist. Sylvia, who was an artist, a social worker, and a socialist. Okay, so she's on the radical left. And her job is to bring in the working class. And then a woman who was like a professional activist, whose name was Annie Kenney. And then Emmeline and Frederick Pethwick Lawrence, you can tell by the name, Pethwick Lawrence. They were members of the gentility. They were moneyed, and they had great organizational skills. So it's their money that's going to pay for all the activities of the WSPU. All right, so they started out in their violent protest by simply harassing politicians. They thought they could get lots of attention by harassing politicians. So Annie Kenney and Christabel, for example, led a movement to disturb liberal meetings. So anytime a liberal politician would have a meeting in London, they would go and they would harass him. They would yell, they would, create havoc. They would do everything they could to make it impossible for them to speak. They would get arrested, and then they would refuse to pay their fines. So they would be sent to prison. And then those outside would protest and write letters to the papers. So that's what their public relations is about. This is how they're getting attention from the media. On October 1905, Annie Kenney and Christabel spat on the police, and they hit them with their pocketbooks. Okay, and then they would get arrested, and they would refuse to pay their fine, and it was becoming clear that you needed to get arrested and not pay your fine, so you got sent to jail. Okay, so that's the point. Okay, so disturbing liberal meetings was how they started. Then they went on to large public demonstrations. In 1908, the Hyde Park demonstration, they adopted colors. Their colors were white, purple, and green. All right, so they would wear white, purple, and green banners. They would wear ribbons in their hats. Their hairpins would have the little ribbons on them. And this is going to become important later with the hairpins, okay? 30,000 marched in the parade around Hyde Park. 300 to 500,000 people watched them. All right, so this is a gigantic parade, something that the Brits were not actually used to having those kinds of numbers. The demonstrators were manhandled by the police and male spectators, just as they were in the United States in the early demonstrations, the one in the just at Wilson's inauguration. Two members of the march were so angry that they filled bags with stones, took a cab to number 10 Downing Street, and threw those bags through Asquith's windows. Of course, they got away. They didn't get arrested. Then they went to marches on Parliament. 1906 began by sending deputations to demand meetings with parliamentary officials and the Prime Minister. Frequently, they were arrested by parliamentary guards and city police when they tried to get in. So on Black Friday, November 18th, 1910, Asquith announced that the Conciliation Bill enfranchising women with property with the right to vote would not be considered. About 1:30 p.m., about 300 women, led by Emmeline, marched on the House of Commons, demanding to see the Prime Minister. He refused. The suffragists rushed Parliament. We've seen how that happens. And they were subjected to police brutality. They also decided they would deface public property. Marion Wallace Dunlap, was convicted of stamping the Bill of Rights on St. Stephen's Hall door of the House of Commons. She was arrested and she went on a hunger strike. This is when the hunger strikes start, and she's released. Now, the women who are doing this, you have to picture this. These are not rabble-rousing women. These are not poor women from the East End. These are women in huge hats, beautiful gowns. They're members of the respectable middle class. Some of their husbands have a lot of money, and a few of them had titles. So when you arrest these women, you don't know what to do with them, all right? So it's easier to release them than it is to actually figure out what to do with them. The hunger strike, after Marion's example, the hunger strike became common practice. After she stamped the Bill of Rights on St. Stephen's Hall, the women's rights advocates smashed the jewel case in the Tower of London. They cut telegraph and telephone wires going out of London. They burned the Orchid House in Kew Gardens. They slashed paintings in national art galleries, and they burned down the refreshment stand in Regent's Park. That's public property. Now they're going to start destroying private property. And their technique there was window breaking. On March the 1st, 1912, several hundred women went to the fashionable West End shopping district of London. Now, if you're familiar with London, this is Piccadilly, Regent Street, Bond Street, Oxford Street. In their muffs, I don't know if you all remember muffs, but in their little muffs, they had hammers. And at the stroke of 5:45, they began methodically, they took the hammers out of their muffs and began methodically smashing plate glass windows in all of the stores, post offices, jewelers, tailors, caterers, shoemakers, and they did not discriminate against anyone. Burberry's, window smashed. Liberties of London, window smashed. Marshall and Snellgrove, no longer there, but their windows were smashed. Estimated damage was £4,000 to £5,000. No one was too concerned because they knew that everybody was insured. And the insurance wasn't too upset because they knew that if this was going to continue, more people would buy insurance. So this was the result of that. Meanwhile, while they're smashing the plate glass windows in the shopping district, 3 women led by Emmeline took a cab to number 10 Downing again, and threw bricks through the windows. They then joined the riot in Haymarket, where police had been called out. Eventually, 120 women were arrested, including Emmeline, who was sent to jail for 2 months. On March the 4th, now 3 days later, a repeat performance took place in Knightsbridge and Brompton Road. And if you're familiar with that, you know that Harrods is in Knightsbridge on Brompton Road. February 15th and 16th, 1913, it's a weekend. And what do members of Parliament do on weekend? They go and play golf. So the suffragists spent the nights damaging the golf courses by digging them up or burning the grass with acid, making messages like votes for women war on government measures, and votes or war. They also dug trenches spelling out votes for women and left hairpins with suffragist colors placed in the ground nearby. So there was no doubt as to who was doing this. They also were involved in assault and attempted murder. They attacked Gladstone on the golf course. They threw roof tiles into Asquith's car. And then they threw a hatchet into Asquith's carriage in order to do some damage. I've already talked about arson. They tried to burn down Theatre Royal. In February 1913, letters filled with phosphorus and other chemicals addressed to the Right Honorable H.H. Asquith, Justice to Women, were dumped on the sorting table of the Central Post Office. 4 men were badly burned trying to put out the fire. On June the 3rd, 1913, the boathouse full of racing craft burned to the ground at Oxford, right next to the bridge with a message, votes for women, no peace until we get the vote. Bombing. February 18th, 1913, sorry, getting ahead of myself here. They bombed a house being built for Lloyd George at 6:10 in the evening. The explosion shook windows 300 yards away. There were 2 bombs. One damaged the windows, ceilings, doors, and plasters of the servants' wing. And the second bomb was in the main part of the house, but it failed to explode. Offenders were unknown, but police found hairpins used to pick the lock near the second bomb. Emmeline Pankhurst assumed responsibility and was again arrested. Suicide. June the 4th, 1913, Derby Day. As the King's horse was about to come around the bend, a woman whose name was Emily Davison ran onto the track. The horse hit her, threw his jockey, and rolled over. Now, if you've ever been to a race course in England, when you stand at the rail, you are really on the rail. It would be really easy to throw yourself over and get onto the racecast to this day. The favorite, Cragmore, was disqualified for bumping another horse when the jockey's attention was diverted by the accident. And the crowd was enraged because they lost their bets. The WSPU card was found on Davis's body, and she wore the colors of the Union around her waist. She died on June 8th. On the day that she died, the grandstand at Hampton Court was burned, presumably by the WSPU. And the funeral procession on June 15th went from Victoria Station to King's Cross. Emmeline Pankhurst, who of course was in jail, had just been arrested. So her empty carriage was driven in the procession. The official response to the violence, I mean, again, I'm saying many of these are very respectable women, is that they were arresting these women and they were sending them to what was called the 2nd Division. Now, the British prison system had 3 divisions. The first division was for political prisoners. If you were a political prisoner, which they claimed they were, okay, you were sent to prison, but you kept your own clothes, you got paper and pencil, you could have, visitors, et cetera, et cetera. The 2nd division was where they sent common felons. So think prostitutes, petty thieves, drunken disorderly, these are a whole different class of women. The 3rd were for hardened criminals. So they were sending these ladies to the 2nd division, in which they were deprived of their clothes and jewelry. They were forced into cells that were dirty and offensive and not something that these ladies were really used to. And the ladies protested by refusing to eat. And so they began to force feed them. Now this is pretty gross, but to force feed someone, you stick a tube down their nose or their throat, and then you pour gruel down it. It's very dangerous because they are struggling. You have to hold them down. If the tube punctures anything inside the body, this can be very, very bad. All right. And so they were force feeding them. And the outrage about force feeding ladies began to grow. And so Parliament actually passed an act called the Cat and Mouse Act in 1913. Now you have to picture this. Think of the 2 houses of Congress, one with red seats, one with green seats, House of Lords, House of Commons. And they actually spent a great deal of time trying to figure out what to do about these women. And so they passed this law called the Cat and Mouse Act that basically said uncooperative prisoners would be released until they recovered and then rearrested when they had recovered their health from the forced feeding. Okay, so they're supposed to turn themselves in or be recaptured when they recovered their health. Now, it was interesting that this worked in this way. It worked well for them in this way, not the women, but Parliament. Out of the 4,000 or 5,000 members of the WSPU, about 200 were imprisoned and force-fed or treated in this way. 200 were imprisoned in 1913 and early 1914. 42 were discharged. Of the 200, 42 were discharged under the Cat and Mouse Act. Some went into hiding, and some promised they would behave themselves and were not rearrested. But what that meant was that you took the most activist, the most women willing to give up the most, and you removed them from the scene. Second thing that happened was that the makeup of the WSPU changed. Sylvia founded the East London Federation, and she got working women interested in the movement. But she offended her sister and her mother, and so they excommunicated her. All right, so she's off in left field. They say she's a socialist. We don't want to have anything to do with her. Christabel, who is the strategist, it's become so dangerous that she decides that she can't any longer stay in Britain. So she moves to Paris and tries to run the movement from Paris. And Emmeline is in and out of jail. So the leadership is dispersed, the membership is dispersed. The most radical people are either behaving themselves or they're in hiding somewhere. And then the Emmeline and Christabel throw the Pethwick Lawrences out of the organization, which means Emmeline was a real dictator, and she didn't like anybody challenging what she was doing. And the Pethwick Lawrences were really committed to this, not just with their money, but they went peacefully on the grounds that, we want this to happen. And if we have to sacrifice ourselves, we will. So the whole leadership really begins to change. At the same time, during the same period, there were women who wanted the right to vote, who were not burning things down and trying to kill the prime minister. They were under the leadership of a woman whose name was Millicent Garrett Fawcett, and her organization was called the National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies. So what she did is to take local societies from Manchester, Edinburgh, Liverpool, took those organizations, put them together under an umbrella society, and they were ladylike, they obeyed the law, they were bigger than the SPU because they were ladylike, they were better financed, they were more democratic, they were more respectable. So that's where it stood when World War I started in 1914. There have been this 2 or 3 years of real violence associated with the women's suffrage movement. The violence declined, mobilization for World War I took up the effort of most women and destroyed any opposition to women's suffrage. The result was that in February 1918, the Representation of the People Act was passed by Parliament, which enfranchised 6 million women. And it was, but the right to vote was still based on property. And all women didn't get the vote until 1928, the Equal Franchise Act, they got equal suffrage with men. Christabel ran unsuccessfully for Parliament in 1918, and eventually she became an evangelical millenarian. So she kind of, took all of her enthusiasm and directed it towards religion. And the first MP in Parliament was an American. Lady Nancy Astor was elected in 1919. She was very, very rich, very, very well connected. So she's the first woman to sit in Parliament. All right, that's the story of Sticks and Stones. I'll be happy to try to answer any questions you might have.
Wow. We do have one question in the chat. I'm sorry, I'm gonna take this off for a minute. And anyone else that has questions, now is a great time to put them in. But the first question that we have actually is about William Elbert Gladstone.
Gladstone?
Yes. So one person says that he died in 1898. So which Gladstone was attacked in 1913? Was that his son?
No, I think it was Asquith that was attacked.
Okay.
Yeah, it was Asquith. I may have misspoken.
Okay.
It was
So in 1913, Asquith was attacked. Okay. And I did, and we have another one. Sorry, technology. Were there any casualties or deaths? Obviously, you mentioned the woman who threw herself in front of
Davison,
a horse.
yeah.
Yes.
Right.
Were there others in addition to that?
No, there were lots of injuries, but not that I know of.
Okay. And I'm sort of curious because prior to your talk, I was doing a little bit of research, and can you speak a little bit, was there collaboration during this time period between the British suffragette movement and the American suffragette movement?
There were letters, definitely. And my book on Belmont indicates that she got involved in suffrage because her daughter had married the Duke of Marlborough, and her daughter was involved in the British suffrage movement. So Alva, who traveled to Europe frequently, particularly to see her daughter, and then she had lots of business and fun in Paris and France, went to some of these demonstrations. And she came back to the United States and said, we're just talking. These women are actually doing something. So she's the one who used her money to fund the radical National Women's Party in the United States to do these kinds of things. She didn't generally participate, but if they needed money, they would get in touch with Alva and she'd send a check. So they were doing. You might be interested. Would you like for me to do a little comparison of the British and American suffrage movement?
I think that would be great.
Okay, all right. Yeah. So I can do that. Okay, some of this will be review, all right? But the women's right to vote movement in both Britain and the United States arises when it becomes clear that gender is the disqualifying characteristics. When all men get the vote and women don't, even if they own property, then it becomes something to really object to. They both emerge from reform movements. The United States evolves from the abolition movement, and the British evolved from the labor movement. So they're both reform movements, but they're different movements. The argument against women's suffrage in both countries was almost identical. Women, if you give women the right to vote, it will destroy the family and male authority in the family, because men are supposed to vote on behalf of their families. So you're going to destroy the family if you give women the right to vote. Women are too emotional. Their brains can't handle the problems. They're too easily persuaded. And since we all know that women are morally superior to men, their superiority would be corrupted by their involvement in politics. We wouldn't want that to happen. So anyway, though the arguments were more or less the same. They were both supported by the middle and upper classes. And the reason that's important is because these are not working women who will eventually become part of both movements. But in the beginning, people who had the time and the money to organize and do this were middle and upper class women. They both had a radical and a moderate component. The Americans had the larger and more law-abiding suffrage movement, and then they had the National Women's Party, who were the radicals. And as I just said, the WSPU was the radical, and Fawcett's organization was the more modern one. So they both, the movement was split. That's a bad thing usually, okay? It divides your fundraising, it divides your campaign for membership. There are all kinds of bad things that come out of having a divided movement. But the one good thing that came out of it was that when you've got radicals causing all kinds of trouble, the moderates look very attractive. So you've got a disadvantage and an advantage for both. Both of these movements were nonpartisan until the very end. All right, so British suffrage movements would have taken any help from conservatives or liberals. It was just that the liberals, they held sort of more responsible because they should theoretically have been more interested in helping them. And the American suffragists didn't discriminate against the Democrats or the Republicans until the very end, when Wilson, of course, was Democrat. And so they began to hold the Democrats responsible. But generally speaking, through that whole thing, they just wanted the votes. They didn't care which party they came from. Another really interesting thing is that both of these movements designed incredibly effective marketing tools to sell the suffrage movement. The first marketing tool was their colors, their banners, this purple, white, and green. But they both began to develop a commercial base in which they began to produce products such as underwear. They had shops, and they got designers and big stores like Burberry's to design, craft, and sell clothing with their colors. So you could buy white, purple, purple and green underwear, or you could buy coats lined with their colors, or you could buy, Alva Belmont, for example, here in the United States, actually commissioned a fine set of china that's white with a blue stripe and it says "Votes for Women." So, I mean, they developed these commercial outlets. They had newspapers and they had magazines in which they solicited advertisements from some of the biggest stores and designers in England. And so they had this basis of commercialization of a reform movement. So they had these artifacts that they encouraged women to buy. The British radicals used violence against property in ways that the Americans never did. The most Americans ever did was to demonstrate in front of the White House during World War I. And they were arrested, not because they destroyed anything, but because they blocked traffic. So they were sent to jail. Same thing happened to them. They sent to jail, they refused to eat, they were force fed, and they were celebrated when they were released from prison. Both adopted the strategy of imprisonment and hunger strikes. And both of them had a large support, but only a small cadre of militants. So they were alike in many ways. And as I said, there was communication between the two. We have letters, but that communication had gone back to the 19th century. We have letters from Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who was a 19th century Votes for Women advocate. And she's writing to reformers in Britain. But the real connection comes with the WSPU and Belmont and Alice Paul, who actually was an American who studied at the London School of Economics, got involved in the suffrage movement, participated in these violent demonstrations, got arrested, force fed, and then she had to come back home to recover. And she starts that idea of creating havoc in order to get attention from the media back here in the United States. Okay.
Wow. Here's another question, a great question here. Were only white women involved? Any women of Asian or African descent from India, Nigeria, Canada, where England had economic interests, thus having immigrants?
Absolutely good question. And as far as I know, the answer is no. I don't, that doesn't mean they didn't participate, it's just that I don't know anything about it.
Right. And as far as the reverse of that being here in the US, do you know of any immigrant individuals? Do you know the makeup of the movement?
Black women were hugely supportive of the vote for obvious reasons. Right. The literature that exists is all about Black and white women. It's not about, we've got Irish American, all the hyphenated right. American, but the black women had a huge impact that has only recently been appreciated.
Right. Another question is, so It's 1918 when the property holding women in England are given the right to vote, but it's not until 1928 when it's
more or less universal.
Universal.
Right.
So what was happening in that 10 years? Were people still campaigning for full equality? How did this 1928 bill come about?
I think generally it was a natural progression, by the end of World War I mean, women had participated in war effort, et cetera, et cetera. And so it's like the resistance to it just kind of faded away. And then it became clear that they needed to equalize it for both men and women. And so 1928, there wasn't much resistance to it. And so there was no need for a great campaign.
Gotcha. And then we do have a comment on the Black women in America, where Black women were involved in America's movement, though they were told to go to the back of the parade.
Oh, yes, absolutely.
So there certainly wasn't the level of equality.
No. And that started really early. That started with the 19th century movement, when after the Civil War, Frederick Douglass, who had always supported women's suffrage even before the Civil War, was asked not to appear in a Southern suffrage organization meeting. And in the parades in Washington, Black women there was a real struggle for them to get themselves included. And then when they did, they couldn't march with everybody else. They had to march at the back of the parade. So yeah, the suffrage movement was not equality.
Right.
wasn't an equal rights organization necessarily.
Right.
It was as racist as the rest of the country. So yes,
right.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. Any other questions? We have some folks here socially distanced and masked. Any questions from this group?
I would like to ask a question, Sylvia. Without the violent aspect of the women's suffrage in both countries, when would women have gotten the right to vote? Did that spur it forward? Did it make enough of an impact that the ones who were more modest in their efforts?
Well, it's hard to say. Let's just think about what it did. First of all, it got them attention that writing little essays to editors of local newspapers and national newspapers wouldn't have gotten. It got them real attention. And as I pointed out, the other thing it did was to point out that, that there was a much bigger organization that wasn't as radical, and it made them look reasonable. We can work with these people. So those are two things that the violence or the threat of violence did. And as I remind you, the Americans really weren't all that violent. We were walking, they were walking in front of the White House with pickets, embarrassing President Wilson, but they were not burning anything down or, threatening his life or whatever. So I think that the violence of the British suffrage movement can be traced back to its origins in the labor movement. And the labor movement was violent. The demonstrations for laborers to get better working conditions and better wages was not always peaceful. And so that's where, because it was the Pankhurst, and because they come out of that Manchester labor movement, I think helps to explain the difference. Most abolitionists, there were abolitionists, of course, who were violent, John Brown being a perfect example, but most abolitionists were not about burning things down. And so the background of reform in the United States wasn't quite as violent as it was in Britain.
Interesting. We have another comment. Interestingly, fashion changed as women became more forthright about their rights.
What changed?
Fashion, clothing.
Oh, fashion. Yes.
Fashion.
Yes.
And I guess to kind of expand on this comment, was that something that they felt empowered to do in any way, or was that just another natural progression of time?
I actually don't know, but I would ask you to picture this. Okay, some of the famous pictures of the British violence is pictures of women in huge skirts and big hats trying to climb over the iron fences of Parliament. Now, they have pikes on the top of them. So, okay, you can get up, but what's going to happen to your skirt when you try to get over the top, right? So as a practical matter, the kinds of clothing they wore in order to rush Parliament, it was not very practical. But the other thing is that when they were attacked by the police, I don't know if you've ever seen a 19th century, early 20th century hat pin. It's huge. I mean, these hats, they wore their hair really high and their hats sat on top of all this hair. And they had these huge hat pins. Their weapon of choice was to take their hat pin out and stick it. I mean, they had nothing else. I mean, they were, generally speaking, they did not have hammers in their muffs, but they did have hat pins. So, so they're defending themselves with their hat pins. So I think reform and changing of fashion is in some way connected, probably. I mean, sort of if you think of the kind of dresses that I'm talking about, late 19th century and early 20th, and then the 1920s flapper. There's a huge difference in terms of restrictiveness, you know, no more corset, right. No more long skirts, no immense petticoats, no huge hats, you know, hair is much simpler. So I think it was just part of the evolution, and whether suffrage had anything to do with it or not, I've never heard anybody suggest that there's a direct connection, but there probably is a cultural connection in some ways. So, yeah.
I mean, it certainly seems that, like you said, the women in the 20s are embracing this kind of new empowerment that they had and expressing that through the way they dress, the bob haircuts, the different things that give them more control.
Right.
In a time where they hadn't had control for
well, the other thing to think about is, you know, when bicycles came in, can you imagine trying to ride a bicycle in those voluminous skirts? And so what they came up with was split skirts. Well, Amelia Bloomer had tried to do that in the early 19th century with the bloomers. And of course, that was, it was considered a disgrace, and no respectable woman would wear it. Of course, Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton did, but you know, it did not take off in the early 19th century. But when there's a practical reason, and you can't ride a bicycle in those kinds of skirts, so you wear a split skirt, and it gets narrower and narrower and narrower until you just chop it off. So, and think about the degree to which riding a bicycle made women mobile. Right. You could ride a bicycle, you didn't have to walk.
Right.
So, mobility, you know, that the whole, I mean, that's just part of the freeing up of the way women related to society and their environment.
And someone had mentioned that in their research, it was said that the bicycle changed to the bloomer. Like they changed their design.
Sure.
For that. So that's an empowering, I guess, of women's fashion.
And think how much, if you're not wearing a corset so you can breathe while you're riding a bicycle, and you don't have those big skirts, which are extremely heavy and awkward, you know, I mean, just freeing of the body is an important development.
Do you know, you may or may not know this off the top of your head, presently, what is the percentage of women in Parliament today?
No idea.
We might need to Google that one.
No idea.
But that would be an interesting comparison, as we are still working through, in the United States,
right,
the movement of women through the political parts of our government, with our new vice president.
That's true.
Breaking a barrier. That's that true. We still continue to break the barriers that these women started breaking before us. So it's pretty exciting. Well, if there are no other questions, I would just like to take the opportunity to thank you.
You're welcome.
I have learned a lot. I hope all of our participants have also learned a lot. This program was recorded and will be available online. If there are additional questions afterwards, you can go to our website, send us an email, and Sylvia is usually fantastic about answering questions when we pose them to her. So we're happy to help you out with that. And yeah, we just ask that you guys follow us on social media, keep an eye out. We've got some other great programs coming up. Sylvia, you're participating in another one in February that we're looking forward to. And we just appreciate the ongoing support from everyone. So Thanks so much.
Thank you very much.
Bye, everyone. Thank you. Oh, wait, before we go, 24.5%, according to someone who Googled, is what the current women in British Parliament
Thank
is.
you.
So thank you, Margaret. We appreciate it. And everyone have a wonderful rest of your weekend and visit us soon. Bye.